so much for taking 40 minutes out of your day today, and welcome to everybody that's joined us. For most of you who know, I'm Emily from Charity Recruit, and for those of you that don't, we specialise in helping charities across the UK work on senior leadership and board appointments. So we spend a lot of our time talking to CEOs, HR leaders, finance directors about the pressures that we're going to talk about today. And this topic has been coming up in almost every conversation that I've been having over the course of the last few months, which has prompted us to put this session together. So it's a virtual boardroom. We're trying to make it conversational. We'd love for you to get involved and bring your questions. So if you want to put your hand up throughout the session or pop your question in the chat, we can pose those to Peter at the end, whichever you would prefer. We're absolutely delighted to be joined by Peter today. Peter's the CEO of the Charities HR Network, and he works with people, leaders, HR professionals right across the sector, which gives him a brilliant overview of how charities are actually responding, what's working and what isn't working, and where boards are focusing their attentions right now. So he's going to talk us through the sort of cost picture, legislative changes, and the practical moves that charities are making around flexibility, alternative resourcing, and workforce planning. So Peter, really lovely to have you, and over to you.
No, thank you so much, Emily. Nice to meet everybody. I'm very happy if you want to jump in with questions as we go along. I'm eminently interruptible. It's absolutely fine. I have got a few slides which I will share, and obviously I'll share those after the session. So if they're useful, you've got those as a reference point later. And yes, who the lady Katie, if you're eating, please carry on. So the plan today is really to kind of run through what's changing. We are seeing some of the biggest employment law changes really in a generation. So what's happening, a little bit about when it's due to happen, although clearly, as anyone who's been watching it will know, the timetable keeps changing, and how organizations are starting to respond to some of those issues and what we're seeing charities starting to do, and some of the things that we think charities should consider. At this stage, a little tiny bit about us. So we're the Charities HR Network. We've been around in various forms for a while, but in its kind of current form for the last 5 years or so. We work with around 200 charities across the UK who have HR functions of some kind. In some cases, they'll be single-handed practitioners because the organisation is quite small. In other cases, it's RSPCA, RSPB, big organizations with big teams, big budgets potentially. And so what I'm trying to do is navigate a little bit of what trends we're seeing across both the large and small charities, but recognizing, we do have HR functions that we deal with, and therefore some of what they're able to do might be different from what smaller organizations can do. But hopefully there's a bit in there for everybody. I'm an HR professional by background. I've worked in various sectors, and I joined the charity sector about 15 years ago. That's my background. So if we jump straight in, what's changing? I've said, and I'll come back to this. It's some of the biggest employment changes we've seen in a very, very long time. The current government really campaigned on this as an issue and are therefore kind of committed to pushing through a lot of the legislative changes that are starting to happen over the next year or so. They've invested a lot of their capital in getting this through. Things we've already seen, clearly you don't need me to tell you, national insurance has increased. There was a 2% increase in national insurance costs, and the national minimum wage has increased. Now, what we've seen in a lot of organizations is that has massively impact on the pay relativities within organizations. So people who were earning 40, 50 pence an hour more than the national minimum wage 2 years ago now aren't. And clearly what organizations haven't been able to do is to shift everybody up. It's just not manageable. And so suddenly you've got quite a chunk of people who didn't think of themselves as earning the national minimum wage who now potentially are. Or if you were a living wage employer, suddenly that's now the minimum wage. And so what do you do to your pay structures to try to redress some of that. In terms of what's coming, some of it's already in. I'm not going to spend massive time because if you Google Employment Rights Act timetable, it's all over the place. But that some of the big changes are the reduction from employment protection period down to 6 months. So up until the 1st of April, in order to be able to take your employer to tribunal, you needed to have worked for them for 2 years. That's now come down to 6 months. And the 6 months actually was pushed through by the House of Lords. So that was they sort of settled on 6 months to avoid having to invoke the Parliament Act because they properly fell out with the House of Lords over this one. And one of the things that struck me when I went to an event recently is just how many of the ministers are former trade union officials. So they were very strongly pushing for day one employment protection rights, but they've settled on 6 months. What that means is after 6 months, you have to treat somebody as if they've been working for you now for 2 years, which means it's not, what does it mean in practice? It means you have to go through a fair process for dismissal. You can't rely on a probation period. You've got to have kind of proper process. And that comes in from January, I think, which means we're really talking about anyone joining your business now, because they will have 6 months by the time we get to that point. So it's a big change. The other thing we're seeing is an increased role for trade unions. Any employer that has more than 21 employees, a trade union can ask for recognition rights. So they can ask to be involved in decision-making around pay. They can ask to be involved in decision-making around employee relations issues. They are having a much more active role. Now, that's slightly terrifying the unions because they're not geared up for that. But we are going to see particularly Unite very actively looking to get into the sector. They reckon at the moment they have around 14% representation in the charity sector. They want to get that to at least 50%. So they're actively targeting this sector as somewhere they can, go to for growth. And there is a whole generation of HR professionals, most of whom are younger than me, although that's not hard, who've never dealt with trade unions, who've never had to sort of sit across the table in a bargaining position to understand the role of shop stewards. There's a lot there in terms of just individuals understanding how those relationships work. Anyone coming out of the public sector probably understands it, but anyone from the private sector and from within our own sector probably has not meaningfully dealt with trade unions.
There's just a quick question on that, sorry,
yeah,
Peter.
of course.
Does the 21 employees represent 21 headcount or 21 full-time equivalent?
21 bodies.
21 bodies. Thank you.
Yeah, so 21 people. And I would suggest that they won't be actively targeting those size of organizations just yet. There are a number of the larger charities who don't currently recognize trade unions. So our sense is that they're targeting those first, and then they'll work their way through. You're seeing an extension of family-friendly rights and statutory sick pay to day one. And statutory sick pay, you normally, up until this point, you were off for 3 days before you got statutory sick pay. Going forward, you get statutory sick pay from day one, and they've removed the lower earnings cap on statutory sick pay. So it's an increase in your costs, which we'll need to talk about. They're also introducing third-party protection from harassment. That is something that this government talked about a lot in opposition, and we're campaigning for. So this is sexual harassment, and this is protection from customers, clients, anybody that an individual may come into contact in their work, not just people they work with. Now, you might look at all of that, and I think many of us in the sector look at that and go, well, that's a lot of change, but in an ideal world, pretty much all of this is what good employers would be doing anyway. I think the challenge for the sector and the challenge for lots of businesses is just how much is changing in a very short period of time. Any other questions before we move on? I mean, as I say, if you Google ERA timetable, it will give you a fairly substantial list of what's changing, but there's a lot there. Okay, so impact for employers. So what we're seeing, the cost of directly employing people are increasing and are increasing quite significantly. So it's not just the national insurance increase, it's not just the minimum wage increase. SSP is going to increase costs. Qualifying period for family leave rights is going to increase costs. It's a kind of whole range of things which come together to say, previously organizations, depending on the pension contributions that they made, might be looking at on costs at around 15%. I think now you've really got to be thinking about your on costs for directly employed people of being over 20%, which is a big change. And a lot of the processes and risks associated with employing people also need to change. So we ran a session with a number of charities earlier this week, and we were talking about probation periods. Most organizations have a probation period that's 6 months. If they have, some have a year, but most have 6 months. That will be too long, because you will not be able to rely on that probation process as the grounds for dismissing somebody. Hi, Lucy. We're just talking about probation periods. So probation periods historically are around 6 months. You're not going to be able to rely on a 6-month probation period. So really what we're recommending is that you reduce your probation periods to 3 months. That means you've got the option to extend it for a month if things aren't going well, which is always a kind of good optic and always shows that the employer is being flexible. But if you have to make the decision within 5 months and 3 weeks. Although it says 6 months, it's not actually 6 months because you have to account for the person's statutory notice period, which is a week. A lot of people are going to fall foul of that. So you're going to need to make decisions around whether this is working out quicker, which means managers are going to need to make those decisions quicker. Your HR processes are going to need to change to reflect that. And I think one of the things we're worried about is that it may drive, certainly in the short term, a bit of behavior towards being more conservative in recruitment. If I've got a shorter period of time in order to make decisions about whether this is working out, I'm going to be less keen to take risks on slightly left field appointments. I may take less risks in terms of bringing people in from other sectors. I may rely less on transferable skills, which means we're suddenly in a market where people are scrabbling around trying to find people who've got charity sector experience. It's a bit early to tell if that's going to happen, but our worry is that's one of the things that is going to happen. Unions are much more involved and much more confident. There's going to be definitely a sense that the unions now see themselves as having a seat at the top table of organizations. And HR professionals and everybody is going to need to be more, it's going to be better equipped, has to be better equipped to deal with unions. I was having a conversation with someone a couple of weeks ago who was having a problem with some very feisty shop stewards who were refusing to allow them to change their probation period. And the answer is, well, you just pick up the phone to their boss. Everyone has bosses. Shop stewards have bosses. They have full-time officers. Those full-time officers don't want lots of noise and lots of they're trying to persuade government that these changes are going to be really easy to implement and aren't going to cause a whole load of extra employment tribunals. Because one of the things to note is there's been no additional funding for the employment tribunal system. So full-time officers in unions do not want job stewards being a pain in the proverbial. They need these relationships to go well. Clearly, protection from third-party sexual harassment. You need to move very quickly if you are starting to hear anything about individuals being harassed at work, wherever that harassment might be coming from. Again, as a good employer, you would want to do that. but now you have to demonstrate that you have systems in place to capture that intelligence and you do something about it when you get it. So again, it's just another risk. The last one is that they're introducing as part, and this has largely gone off the radar for most people, they're introducing no cap to tribunal compensatory awards. So if you take your employer to tribunal, you can get two elements of an award. One is lost salary, and the other is compensation. Whether that's compensation for hurt feelings, whether it's compensation for damaged reputation. Currently, that is capped at a year's pay. What that means is it's much easier to negotiate, particularly with senior people, if you are making the decision that someone needs to move on and you're looking at some kind of settlement arrangement, they know that they can't get more than a year's pay. That's going to change. So now it's going to be, what do they think this claim is worth, which might be significantly more than a year's pay. So it's just something, it sounds a bit of an academic change, but if you fall out with senior people and you end up having to let people go through things like settlement agreements, then those costs are going to increase potentially quite significantly. Sounds a bit of a trauma. There's a lot going on. I mean, I've said this before, it is the biggest change to the employment relationship in a generation and is going to have an impact well beyond your HR team. We're in the process of putting together a survey within the sector involving Unison and the Department of Business and Trade around, how are organizations managing this? And the biggest thing we're seeing and saying to people is this is a board issue. This isn't an HR issue, this is a board issue, because it changes the dynamic in terms of how we manage people, the processes we manage people, and the risks potentially associated in getting it wrong. And if HR people are struggling to get cut through on that, then the suggestion is use the organization's risk register. That's the kind of corporate lever for flagging that this is a big issue and it's not just an HR kind of nerdy issue. This is actually going to have an impact on how managers manage, how organizations recruit, and the number of people that an organization can actually employ. In terms of workforce planning, we did a survey a couple of years ago, and I don't think this figure has changed. And this is, again, remember, this is large charities, many of whom have, HR functions. Were you doing anything vaguely resembling strategic workforce planning? The answer was no. So 70% of the people we spoke to do not have anything that looks like a workforce plan, which is a bit of a problem, particularly in this context. So I would be saying, in your organizations, make sure the board are aware that this is happening. They don't need to know the detail. They need to be reassured that the detail is being managed. But the way you manage people and the risks associated with it might look quite different. And one of the things, and I realized that I put most charities, of course, I don't know that because I've not dealt with, 115,000 charities, but most of the charities we work with and have experience of really only think about directly employing people or having them as volunteers. There isn't really anything else. So when we talk to directors in businesses and CEOs in businesses, they talk about the number of people they employ, they talk about the headcount, they talk about full-time equivalent, directors talk about the full-time equivalent in their teams. And that's the measure for the resources that they have available to them to get stuff done. And what we're saying right across the sector is we are going to have to be more flexible than that. I think the private sector has been for some time, but we are going to have to start to think about other ways of doing things. What we're talking to organizations about is, do you have work that would benefit from having come in and do it for 6 months? Now, there are downsides to that. They don't have the long-term commitment to the organization. They don't necessarily share the identity with the cause in the same way that someone who's permanently employed, but you don't have the long-term costs associated with having that person on the books. There are also quite a lot of non-employed options. One of the things that the government thankfully have kicked into the long grass is the review of the employment model. I think they've realised that this was too much change in too short a period of time. So although you still have to work within the constraints of IR35 and non-IR35, and if anybody doesn't know what that means, I'm sure Emily can fill you in. But it means, you are able to bring in people to do a very specific piece of work for you, and then they leave the business. There's no employment model. There's no expectations around employment rights. They literally come in, do a piece of work, and then leave. And as long as that is a short-time piece of work, it's probably, I would say, around 6 months, then actually there are lots of people out there working as consultants. And particularly if you're looking at things like areas like digital, for example, where we, for salaries, might be competing with organizations with much bigger budgets, you might find it's a much more cost-effective use of your budget to have somebody in who really smashes it for 6 months rather than someone who comes in as an employee and might take that bit longer because they've got all of those sort of induction issues and things. So we're strongly suggesting that organizations are more flexible with their employment models and getting stuff done. So short-term contracts, non-employed options, and also sharing resource. There are options for organizations. One of the challenges for a lot of charities is we're quite small. Even big charities like RSPCA, RSPB, you compare them against big organizations outside the sector, and they're tiny. So they may not have the capacity or the demand to have a very expensive AI person on their books, but they might be able to share it with another charity. Your chief execs will have networks. There will be ways of kind of talking to people to say, well, look, if we hosted this person on our books, would you help us with the costs? In which case they can come and work with you and do what you need to do. So we're seeing the increase in all of those kind of options being considered by organizations. But again, that it's not HR nerdery. This is about boards understanding that, being able to walk into a room and count how many people you've got working there because they sit on your budget. Those days are potentially gone, at least in the short term, because you're going to need to use different kinds of resource in different ways. Next step.
Just before we move on,
Yeah,
we
of
just
course.
had a question from Katie Joe on the previous slide, just asking
Yeah.
if you can explain the no qualifying period for family leave rights.
So, you've got me in the detail there. They're introducing paternity leave from day one, and I think some flexible maternity from day one as well. Now, how much that will need to be paid is one of the things that they're still working out. But I think we can safely assume that, employers will end up picking up some of the costs for people taking extended periods of family leave from day one, as opposed to having to wait for a qualifying period.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying.
That's right. So what can organizations do? The first thing to say is get it on the board's agenda if it isn't already. There's a lot of change going through. I would say look at your current plans. What is your organization looking to try and do over the next 18 months, 2 years? Particularly anything that you're looking to do that's new or project work. And to say, well, is there another way of giving us the capacity to deliver that work? Are there other other workforce models that we could use that will help us deliver that? Could we get a consultant in? Could we get a contractor in? Could we outsource it? We're starting to see the creeping in of outsourcing. Now, as someone who worked in an outsourcer for 10 years, I'd always caveat that with a little bit of, if you can't do it for that much, an outsourcer probably can't do it either. But it's certainly something to look at. Make sure your legal and HR provision is adequate. Lots of organizations don't have HR provision. They will be relying on In some cases, the banks, in some cases, independent companies, some of whom are very good, who are supporting you in terms of navigating some of these challenges. Make sure you keep them close to you. Make sure they know what's going on, because clearly they're slammed. Clearly, there's a lot of change going on. Lots of organizations are having to respond to this. So if you have a legal service that provides your HR support, make sure you keep them close. Don't just draft them in when something goes horribly wrong. Does your budget provision, if you operate that way in terms of headcount, does that reflect the on-costs for the new arrangements? I would say you need to look at your on-costs. Whatever provision you have in place within your budget framework needs to be increased. I would say probably by about 5%. Look at your, I hate the word onboarding, but look at your onboarding. I often hear the phrase, well, we need them to hit the ground running. It's like, well, you're not dropping them from a plane, are you? Everybody's going to have a bit of an induction crisis. But now you need to be pretty comfortable that this person is going to be right within about 3 months. That enables you to potentially extend a probation period. If you have lots of people coming in doing the same sort of job, then there are options around, could you test their knowledge, for example? Have they picked up the knowledge that they need in order to be able to kind of move on? But however you choose to do it, and there's lots of different practice out there depending on the size of the organization, the number of people involved, you need, and your managers need, to have a pretty good idea about whether this person's going to be right within about 3 or 4 months. I put this as a question. This is very much linked to the no cap on the compensatory awards. How would you manage if you fell out with one of your senior team? Because at the moment there are caps in place. You can put in potentially not hugely expensive provision to exit somebody from the business if that's what's needed. Those costs are going to increase. How would you manage it? People are going to know if things are going wrong that there's potentially more money available to them if they raise a claim against you. Our lawyers, we work with a company called Bates Wells. They're already seeing an increase in tribunal claims. The other thing around that as well, which I haven't mentioned, is around how you would manage if somebody raised the question, particularly during onboarding, that they have a disability. The rules around managing disabilities haven't changed. But again, potentially you've got a shorter period of time in which to deal with them. What would you do if a union asked for representation rights? They will just write to you and say, we believe we have members working in your organization. Therefore, we want representation rights. So somebody needs to have a pretty good, clear picture about what that looks like. Clue, make sure they have regular branch meetings. Trade shop stewards tend to have a hobby of going out and telling people that they're talking on behalf of the workforce whilst never actually talking to the workforce. And make sure that your senior leadership team are keeping an eye on this and understanding as the kind of timeline changes. So we're looking at changes in October, we're looking at changes next January, and again potentially in April. So I haven't run through the full timeline because you can, as I say, you can just Google that. But as you come up to these milestone events, make sure that the senior leadership team are getting an update so that they understand the risk involved. I'm going to stop because the next slide just says questions. So I'm conscious there's a lot there, but were there any questions in the chat, Emily, or anyone wanted to jump in with a question at this point?
I think we've covered the questions as we were going. So any questions from anybody else now we've come to the end? It'd be great to hear from you.
Have I scared everyone? Sorry.
Do you want to talk us through the survey that you're doing?
Yeah, so we're working. One of the things that's changed actually, which is quite interesting, is for those of you who know the sector, historically government have consulted with NCVO on a lot of these employment changes. They aren't now, they're actually coming to talk to us. So that's been quite a big change, and we're sort of talking to NCVO about that. But we're launching a survey which is not just for HR Network members, it's really across the sector. And as far as we're aware, we're the only sector doing it, which is why the Department of Business Trade are interested. So round about end of June, we'll be launching a survey right across the sector saying how are organizations managing it. So what are some of the things that organizations are doing? Is it something that's on the organization's kind of senior leadership radar? Is it something that HR are just being asked to sort out? Are you changing probation periods? You know, what have you recognized unions? As I say, a lot of HR people have never had to deal with unions because realistically, for most of the last 10 years, outside the public sector, unions really didn't get a lot of traction. You could get cheap car insurance, but that was about the sum total of the value. They very much see this as an opportunity to get into the sector, and they are actively targeting the sector.
Wow. We've had a question from Justin there to say, will the changes to compensation caps be retrospective?
No, they won't. That's certainly the information we've been given. So no, they won't. They will reflect any claims that come in from the date that changes.
Good stuff. Any other questions before we let? Oh, here we go. Oh, that was very helpful.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you. I'm glad. Thank you.
Okay, well, just a quick thank you then to everyone that's joined us and contributed in the chat. I think it's really important that conversations like these happen, and that sharing of information, you know, is really valuable to the sector. So thank you so much, Peter, for giving up your time.
That's okay. Yeah, I will share the slideshow. Yeah, of course. And as I say, if you Google Employee Rights Act timetable, there's any number of sources up there, including the Department of Business Trade.
Perfect. If there's anything Peter's not covered today, or you've got a question for Peter, I'm sure you'd be happy to speak to you. You know, so do reach out either to Peter directly over LinkedIn, or you can come through myself, and I'll happily put you in touch. So yeah, please feel free to reach out. We'll send a link to the recording of today's session and Peter's presentation. If you're happy for us to have the slides,
Yeah, of course.
Peter, we can get that out to you over the course of the next day or so. And we run boardrooms like this on a monthly basis, so do keep your eye on our LinkedIn page for our upcoming forums. But yeah, thanks again to everybody. Thanks, Peter, and enjoy the rest of your day.